Hello, bored people. Welcome back to Muted History, where we dig into the stories that shaped our world, one forgotten chapter at a time. Whether you're here to fall asleep to some deep history, procrastinating on work, or just curious about how we got to where we are today, you're in the right place. Tonight, we're telling one of the most extraordinary partnerships in the history of life on Earth. It's the story of how a small fox-sized creature with multiple toes became humanity's greatest ally, our fastest messenger, our most trusted companion in war, and eventually our most poignant symbol of freedom. This is the full story of horses and us, from their humble beginnings in ancient forests to their near disappearance from the Americas, and finally to their transformation into something that lives more in our imagination than our daily lives. But before we dive into saddles and civilizations, we need to go back much, much further. Back to a time when horses weren't horses at all, when the world was recovering from the greatest catastrophe it had seen in millions of years, and when our story begins not with hoofbeats but with the soft padding of tiny feet through prehistoric undergrowth. Picture this: 55 million years ago, the Earth looked nothing like the planet we know today. There were no grasslands stretching to the horizon, no thundering herds, no cowboys or cavalry charges. Instead, dense tropical forests covered most of the continents. The climate was a furnace compared to today, with palm trees growing where we now find polar ice, amps that would one day become the frozen of dinosaurs just 11 million years earlier. In Theed, it was still healing from the asteroid impact that had ended the age, and crocodiles basking in SW tundra of the Arctic. This was the world of the Paleocene and early Eocene epochs, an ecological vacuum left behind by the giants. Mammals were finally getting their chance to experiment, to diversify, to fill niches that had been closed to them for over 100 million years. And in the steamy forests of what would eventually become North America, a small creature was taking its first tentative steps toward a destiny no one could have imagined. Scientists call it Eohippus, the dawn horse, though if you encountered one in those ancient woodlands, you might mistake it for a peculiar dog, or perhaps a small deer. It stood barely 2 feet tall at the shoulder, weighed about as much as a house cat, and possessed 4 toes on its front feet and 3 on its back feet, not a single hoof in sight. These early horses were browsers, not grazers. Their teeth were small and low-crowned, perfect for nibbling soft leaves, fruits, and shoots from the forest understory. They moved carefully through the dense vegetation, always alert for the predators that ruled this humid world. Their limbs were flexible and short, built for manoeuvring around fallen logs and through tangled vines, not for the open country running that would define their descendants millions of years later. What's remarkable about this period is how unremarkable these early horses seemed. They were just one of dozens of mammalian experiments happening simultaneously across the warming planet. There were early whales with legs, bizarre hoofed predators, and flying lemurs the size of small bears. The Eohippus wasn't special, wasn't destined for greatness. It was simply another small herbivore trying to make a living in a world that was constantly shifting beneath its feet. But the world was indeed shifting, literally and figuratively. The continents were drifting toward their modern positions. Volcanic activity was reshaping landscapes, and most importantly for our story, the climate was beginning its long, slow dance towards something cooler and drier. These changes would take millions of years to unfold, but they would ultimately transform not just the horse, but the entire face of the planet. As we move forward through deep time, we encounter the descendants of Eohippus, each slightly different from their ancestors, each adapted to the slowly changing world around them. Orohippus appeared around 40 million years ago, still small, still multi-toed, but with slightly longer legs and a hint of the changes to come. Epihippus followed, then Mesohippus, each generation subtly modified by the relentless pressure of natural selection. But the most dramatic transformation was still millions of years away, triggered not by any sudden evolutionary leap, but by the rise of an unassuming plant that would reshape the entire terrestrial ecosystem. Grass. Today, Grasslands cover nearly 40% of Earth's land surface, supporting everything from zebras in Africa to bison on the Great Plains. But 40 million years ago, grass was a marginal player, restricted to disturbed areas and forest edges. The dominant vegetation was still trees, and the animals that lived among them were adapted for life in the shadows and dappled sunlight of the forest canopy. Then something began to shift. The global climate started its long slide toward cooler, drier conditions. Polar ice caps began to form for the first time in millions of years. Sea levels dropped. And most crucially, the great forests that had dominated the Eocene began to fragment and retreat. Into the spaces between the shrinking woodlands came grass. Not the manicured lawns of suburbia, but tough, resilient species that could survive drought, fire, and the constant trampling of large herbivores. These grasses had evolved a secret weapon that would make them nearly unstoppable. They grew from their base, not their tips. You could eat the top of a grass plant, burn it, or crush it under 1,000 hooves, and it would simply grow back, often stronger than before. But grass presented a problem for the animals that tried to eat it. Unlike the soft leaves of forest plants, grass was tough, fibrous, and loaded with silica particles that wore down teeth like sandpaper. Any animal that wanted to make a living eating grass would need to evolve new teeth, new digestive systems, and new ways of life. The early horses that encountered this spreading grassland world faced a choice, though of course they couldn't know it at the time. They could retreat with the forests, becoming increasingly specialized browsers in shrinking woodland refuges, or they could adapt to this new, harsh open landscape where food was abundant but difficult to digest, where predators could spot you from miles away, and where survival depended not on stealth but on speed. Some horse lineages chose the forests and eventually disappeared into evolutionary dead ends. But others began the long, slow process of adaptation that would transform them from small multi-toed browsers into the swift, single-toed grazers we know today. This transformation didn't happen overnight. Evolution rarely works that way. Instead, over millions of years, through countless generations of subtle modifications, the horse began to change. Legs grew longer and stronger, the side toes gradually shrank as more weight shifted to the central digit. Teeth became higher crowned and more complex, better able to grind tough grass without wearing away to useless nubs. By the time we reach the Miocene epoch, roughly 23 million years ago, we encounter horses like Merychippus, animals that would begin to look familiar to modern eyes, still three-toed, but with most of their weight carried on the central toe, still smaller than modern horses, but with the longer legs and more efficient stride of a plains runner, and most importantly, with high crowned teeth perfectly adapted for processing grass. These Miocene horses lived in a world that was increasingly dominated by vast grasslands. The climate continued to cool and dry, forests retreated to river valleys and mountain slopes, and the stage was set for one of the most spectacular adaptive radiations in mammalian history. Dozens of horse species emerged, each slightly different, each testing a different solution to the challenges of grassland life. Some remained relatively small and retained their three toes. Others grew larger and began to rely almost entirely on their central digit. Some specialized in particular types of grass or specific habitats. Others remained generalists, able to survive in a variety of environments. For several million years, North America was home to an incredible diversity of horses, a living laboratory of evolutionary experimentation. But as is so often the case in evolution, this diversity was not destined to last. Climate change, competition, and simple bad luck began to winnow the ranks of horse species. Many lineages disappeared entirely, leaving behind only fossils to mark their brief moment in the sun. Others persisted, but in reduced numbers, their ranges shrinking as the world continued to change around them. By the Pliocene epoch, around 5 million years ago, the horse family tree had been pruned dramatically. Only a handful of species remained, but among them were the direct ancestors of all modern horses, zebras, and asses. These animals had finally achieved the single toe that we now consider the defining characteristic of the horse. Their teeth had reached the ultimate in grass processing efficiency. Their limbs had been refined into precision instruments of speed and endurance. They were no longer the small, timid browsers of the ancient forests. They were plains runners, built for a life of constant movement across open landscapes where survival depended on the ability to outrun predators and migrate vast distances in search of food and water. They had become, in every sense that matters, true horses. But this evolutionary success story was about to take an unexpected turn. For while horses were perfecting their grassland lifestyle in North America, spreading across the continent in vast herds that must have rivaled the great migrations of modern Africa, they were also preparing for a journey that would take them far from their evolutionary homeland. The Bering Land Bridge, that famous highway between continents, was about to open, and when it did, horses would walk across it into Asia, beginning a new chapter of their story that would eventually lead them into partnership with a clever primate species that was just beginning to experiment with fire, tools, and the radical idea that animals might be more useful alive than dead. But for now, we leave that a story for our next chapter, our horses, as they were at the end of the Pliocene, wild, free, and perfectly adapted to a grassland world that stretched from Alaska to Mexico. They had no idea that their descendants would one day carry human warriors into battle, pull ploughs across fertile fields, race around tracks for the entertainment of crowds, or become the stuff of legend and symbol. They were simply horses doing what horses do, running, grazing, surviving in a world that demanded nothing less than perfection in motion. And in that perfection, the stage was set for one of the most remarkable partnerships in the history of life on Earth. The story we've been telling so far has unfolded entirely in North America, the evolutionary birthplace of horses. But around 3 million years ago, something remarkable happened that would scatter horses across the globe and set the stage for their eventual meeting with humanity. The Bering Land Bridge opened. This wasn't a bridge in any sense we'd recognise today. It was a vast expanse of dry land, hundreds of miles wide, connecting what we now call Alaska and Siberia. During ice ages, when massive glaciers locked up enormous amounts of seawater, ocean levels dropped dramatically, exposing this continental shelf and creating a highway between worlds. The first horses to make this journey weren't thinking about exploration or conquest. They were simply following their instincts, moving in search of fresh grazing grounds as their populations expanded and resources became scarce. But this migration would prove to be one of the most consequential movements in natural history. These early horse migrants found themselves in a landscape both familiar and alien. The Eurasian steppes offered the same grasslands they were adapted for, but the climate was harsher, the winters longer and more brutal. The predators were different too. Instead of the American lions and dire wolves they knew, they faced cave lions, cave hyenas, and eventually early human hunters who were just beginning to develop sophisticated hunting strategies. But horses proved remarkably adaptable. They spread across Asia and into Europe, diversifying into new species and subspecies as they encountered different environments. Some became stocky and cold adapted for life in northern regions. Others remained fleet and gracile for the warmer southern grasslands. The horse had become a truly global phenomenon. Meanwhile, back in their American homeland, horses continued to thrive. The fossil record from this period shows an incredible abundance of horse species across North and South America. They had become one of the dominant large mammals of the New World, filling ecological niches from the Arctic tundra to the tropical grasslands of what would become Argentina. But this success story was building toward a mystery that would puzzle scientists for generations. Because despite their evolutionary triumph, Despite millions of years of continuous presence in the Americas, horses were about to vanish from their birthplace entirely. Not gradually, not through slow decline, but suddenly and completely, leaving behind only bones and questions. The end began around 15,000 years ago, during what paleontologists call the Late Pleistocene Extinction event. This was a time of massive environmental upheaval. The last ice age was coming to an end, glaciers were retreating, sea levels were rising, and ecosystems across the globe were being reshuffled like cards in a deck. But climate change alone doesn't explain what happened next. Because while horses were disappearing from the Americas, they were thriving in Eurasia. The difference, many scientists now believe, was the arrival of a new predator. Not a saber-toothed cat or a giant bear, but something far more dangerous: modern humans. The first people to reach the Americas were skilled hunters armed with sophisticated spear throwers and razor-sharp stone points. They encountered a landscape filled with animals that had never learned to fear human beings. Massive ground sloths, giant beavers, American camels, and yes, horses. These animals had no evolved responses to human hunting pressure, no instinctual wariness of these new bipedal predators. The result was catastrophic. Within a few thousand years, most of North America's large mammals had vanished. The horses that had evolved on this continent for over 50 million years were gone, leaving behind only their bones buried in sediment layers and their living relatives on the far side of the world. This extinction created one of the most poignant ironies in natural history. The horse, which would one day become synonymous with the American frontier, with cowboys and cavalry and the conquest of the West, was absent from the Americas for nearly 10,000 years. The vast grasslands that had shaped their evolution were left to bison, elk, and deer. The thunder of hoofbeats fell silent, but while horses disappeared from one half of the world, they were about to enter a new chapter of their story in the other half. Because in the steppes and grasslands of Eurasia, early human societies were beginning to look at horses with new eyes, not just as prey to be hunted, but as potential partners in the great adventure of civilization. The transition from hunting horses to domesticating them was neither sudden nor simple. It likely began with opportunistic relationships. Perhaps injured foals were taken in and raised by human families. Perhaps certain horse populations became semi-tame through generations of living near human settlements, feeding on crop residues and gradually losing their fear of these strange two-legged creatures. Archaeological evidence for the earliest horse domestication is frustratingly sparse and controversial. We find horse bones in human settlements, but bones alone can't tell us whether these animals were hunted, scavenged, or domesticated. We find what might be bits and bridles, but organic materials rarely survive thousands of years in the archaeological record. What we do know is that by around 4,000 years ago, something had fundamentally changed in the relationship between horses and humans. Suddenly horses appear in human burials, not as food offerings, but as companions for the journey to the afterlife. We find evidence of horse sacrifice, elaborate harness fittings, and most tellingly, human skeletons, showing the characteristic wear patterns of people who spent their lives on horseback. The cultures responsible for this transformation were the pastoral peoples of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grasslands stretching from the Black Sea to the Ural Mountains. These were not the first humans to domesticate animals, but they may have been the most revolutionary, because unlike cattle or sheep or goats, which simply provided food and materials, horses provided something entirely new: speed. For the first time in human history, a person could travel faster than their own legs could carry them. A message could be delivered across vast distances in days rather than weeks. Herds could be managed across territories larger than entire modern countries, and most ominously for settled agricultural peoples everywhere, warfare could become mobile, striking suddenly and retreating before any organised response was possible. The horse didn't just change transportation, it changed the very structure of human society. Mobile pastoral peoples now had enormous advantages over their sedentary neighbours. They could raid and retreat, appear and disappear like ghosts across the landscape. They could control trade routes, extract tribute from settled communities, and build empires that stretched across continents. This new, a few centuries, domesticated horses had reached horse-human partnership, spread with remarkable speed, within China, India, Egypt, and Western Europe. Each culture adapted the horse to its own needs and environment, creating distinct breeds and traditions that would persist for thousands of years. In the ancient Near East, horses became the foundation of chariot warfare, pulling lightweight vehicles carrying archers and spearmen into battle with devastating effect. The Assyrians, Persians, and other great empires of the region built their military might on the backs of carefully bred and trained war horses. In China, horses were so valuable that entire wars were fought to secure access to the best breeding stock. The famous heavenly horses of Fergana were said to sweat blood, and Chinese emperors sent armies across thousands of miles of desert to obtain them. These horses became symbols of imperial power, depicted in art and poetry as divine beings capable of flying through the heavens. But it was perhaps on the steppes themselves that the horse-human bond reached its most intimate and sophisticated form. Among peoples like the Scythians, Mongols, and other nomadic cultures, horses weren't just tools or weapons. They were partners, companions, and extensions of the human self. Children learned to ride before they could walk properly. Warriors were buried with their horses, and the great horse herds became the measure of wealth, power, and cultural identity. These steppe peoples developed horsemanship to an art form that has rarely been equalled. They could shoot arrows accurately from horseback at full gallop, control their mounts with subtle shifts in weight and position, and maintain vast herds across seasonal migrations that covered thousands of miles. Their horses weren't just domesticated, they were integrated into human society at the deepest possible level. And it was from these steppe cultures that horses would eventually spread to every corner of the habitable world. Through trade, conquest, and cultural exchange, the partnership between horse and human became one of the defining features of civilization itself. The age of the horse had begun, and it would last for thousands of years, shaping everything from the layout of cities to the poetry of love, from the strategies of empire to the dreams of freedom that still echo in our modern world. But that transformation from wild creature to civilizational partner was just the beginning of the horse's remarkable journey through human history, because ahead lay centuries of partnership, conflict, and change that would take horses from the steppes of Central Asia to the battlefields of Europe, the rice paddies of Asia, and eventually, in one of history's most circular turns, back to the grasslands of their birth in the Americas. The story of horses and humans wasn't built in a day, and it certainly wasn't built with handshakes and formal agreements. What happened between 4000 and 2000 BCE was messier, more experimental, and far more intimate than we often imagine. It was a time of trial and error, of broken bones and brilliant innovations, of cultures that rose and fell based on their ability to master this new partnership with an animal that could kill them as easily as carry them. The archaeological record from this period reads like a medical examiner's report. Human skeletons from across the Eurasian steppes show telltale signs of lives spent on horseback. Compressed vertebrae, enlarged muscle attachment points, and the kind of repetitive stress injuries that come from gripping with your legs for hours at a time while something powerful moves beneath you. These weren't weekend riders. These were people whose bodies had been reshaped by their relationship with horses. But the horses were changing too, in ways both subtle and profound. The process we call domestication isn't just about taming wild animals, it's about fundamentally altering their biology, their behaviour, and their relationship to the world around them. Wild horses are creatures of flight, programmed by millions of years of evolution to run first and ask questions later. domestic horses had to learn to override these instincts, to trust human judgment even when every fibre of their being screamed danger. The earliest horse tamers accomplished this transformation through a combination of careful selection and patient training that would have made modern animal behaviourists proud. They chose the calmest individuals from wild herds, the ones least likely to panic at human approach. They worked with young foals whose natural bonding instincts could be redirected toward human caretakers, and they developed techniques for gentling adult horses that relied more on psychology than force. We can see evidence of this sophistication in the tools they developed. The earliest bits weren't crude implements designed to inflict pain, but carefully crafted pieces of antler and bone that distributed pressure evenly across the horse's mouth. Early saddles and harnesses were marvels of engineering, designed to maximize comfort for both horse and rider while allowing for the kind of precise communication necessary for mounted warfare and herding. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of early horse domestication was its speed. Unlike cattle or sheep, which took thousands of years to fully adapt to human partnership, horses seem to have made the transition relatively quickly. Within a few centuries of the first tentative experiments in horse taming, we see evidence of sophisticated riding cultures spread across thousands of miles of steppe territory. This rapid adoption suggests that horses filled a need that other domestic animals simply couldn't meet. They weren't just another source of meat or milk, though they provided both. They were something entirely new in human experience, a way to transcend the limitations of human biology, to move faster and farther than any person could on foot. The cultures that mastered this new technology gained enormous advantages over their neighbours. They could control vast territories, manage huge herds of other animals, and project military power across distances that would have been impossible for infantry-based societies. The horse didn't just change warfare, it changed the very concept of political control. Consider the Botai culture of northern Kazakhstan, one of the earliest societies we can definitively identify as horse domesticators. These people lived around 3500 BCE in settlements along river valleys, but their economy was built almost entirely around horses. Archaeological excavations have revealed thousands of horse bones, evidence of mare's milk consumption, and what appear to be the remains of corrals and training facilities. The Botai weren't just keeping horses, they were managing them on an industrial scale. Their settlements contained more horse bones than all other animal species combined, suggesting a level of specialization that would have been impossible without sophisticated knowledge of horse behavior and biology. They knew how to breed for specific traits, how to manage large herds across seasonal migrations, and how to extract maximum value from every animal. But the Botai story also reveals the fragility of these early experiments in horse domestication. Despite their apparent success, the culture disappeared from the archaeological record around 3000 BCE, leaving behind only their tools, bones, and the genetic legacy of their horses. Whether they were absorbed by other cultures, displaced by climate change, or simply evolved into something we haven't yet recognized, we may never know. What we do know is that their innovations didn't die with them. The techniques they developed for horse management spread across the steppes, carried by traders, raiders, and migrants who recognized the value of these new partnerships. By 2500 BCE, evidence of horse domestication appears from the Black Sea to the borders of China, suggesting a rapid diffusion of both animals and knowledge. This spread wasn't uniform or uncontested. Different cultures developed different approaches to horse management, reflecting their unique environments and needs. Some focused on breeding large, powerful animals suitable for pulling heavy loads. Others selected for speed and agility, creating the foundation for what would become cavalry warfare. Still others emphasized endurance, developing horses capable of covering vast distances across harsh terrain. The diversity of these early horse cultures is reflected in the archaeological record. We find elaborate horse burials in some regions, suggesting that these animals had achieved almost sacred status. In others, horse bones show cut marks, indicating they were still primarily viewed as food sources. Some cultures developed sophisticated tack and riding equipment, while others seem to have used horses primarily for pulling carts and chariots. But beneath this diversity lay a common thread: the recognition that horses represented something fundamentally different from other domestic animals. They weren't just livestock, they were partners in a new way of life that offered unprecedented mobility, power, and prestige. The cultures that successfully made this transition would go on to shape the course of human history for the next 4,000 years. The transformation of the horse from wild prey animal to domestic partner also had profound effects on the animals themselves. Domestic horses began to show physical changes that distinguished them from their wild relatives. Their coats became more varied in colour and pattern. Their ears grew longer and more mobile. Their faces became more expressive, better able to communicate with human handlers. More importantly, their behaviour changed in ways that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had only known wild horses. Domestic horses learned to tolerate human touch, to respond to vocal commands, and to suppress their natural flight responses in favour of learned behaviours. They developed the capacity for what animal behaviourists call social referencing, looking to human handlers for cues about how to respond to unfamiliar situations. This behavioural transformation wasn't just a matter of training individual animals. It represented a fundamental shift in the horse's relationship with the world. Wild horses live in a constant state of vigilance, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. Domestic horses learn to transfer that vigilance to their human partners, trusting that we would watch for threats while they focused on other tasks. The implications of this change can hardly be overstated. For the first time in the history of life on Earth, a large, powerful prey animal had willingly subordinated its survival instincts to the judgment of a potential predator. It was a leap of faith that would reshape both species in ways that are still unfolding today. As we move forward in our story, we'll see how this partnership between horse and human expanded beyond the steppes to influence every major civilization on Earth. We'll witness the rise of chariot warfare, the development of cavalry tactics, and the emergence of horse-based cultures that would dominate vast regions for centuries. But for now, it's worth pausing to appreciate the magnitude of what had been accomplished by these early horse tamers. They had taken one of nature's most perfectly adapted running machines and convinced it to carry them into an uncertain future. In doing so, they had set the stage for one of the most remarkable partnerships in the history of life on Earth. A relationship that would endure through millennia of change and challenge, shaping the destiny of both species in ways that neither could have imagined. The horse was no longer just a creature of the wild steppes. It had become something new, a bridge between the human world and the natural one, a living symbol of our capacity to forge connections across the boundaries of species. And that transformation was just the beginning. The everything these early horse cultures had built. New world was changing in ways that would challenge. Technologies were emerging, populations were growing, and the wide around 2000 BCE, the partnership between horse and human that had emerged on the steppes was about open grasslands that had nurtured to face its first great test. Because thousands of years, agricultural societies had been content. First mounted societies were increasingly coming into contact with the vast grasslands with new interest. Techniques improved and populations expanded. These settled peoples began to ides and their horses, but as farming to stay put, growing their crops different kind of human civilization. The farmers, for in fertile river valleys and leaving the harsh steppes to the Nom, saw land that could be ploughed, rivers that could be dammed, and resources that could be controlled. The collision between these two worlds would reshape both horses and humans in ways that neither side could have anticipated. Because what happened next wasn't just a clash of cultures, it was the beginning of a new chapter in the horse's story, one that would see them the engines of empire. The first great transformed from the companions of nomads into horse-powered empire emerged not on the steppes themselves, but on their edges, where grassland met fertile soil and nomadic culture encountered agricultural wealth. The Hittites, ruling from their capital in central Anatolia around 1600 BCE, became the first civilization to truly understand the military potential of horses. But they didn't just copy the riding techniques of the steppes, they innovated. Instead of mounting horses directly, the Hittites harnessed them to lightweight, two-wheeled chariots that could carry archers and spear throwers into battle with devastating speed and mobility. This wasn't just an improvement on existing technology, it was a revolution in warfare. For the first time, an army could combine the shock of cavalry charge with the precision of archery, striking enemy formations and retreating before any effective counterattack could be organised. The Hittite war chariot was a marvel of Bronze Age engineering, built from carefully selected woods and bound with leather and bronze fittings. It was light enough to be pulled by two horses at high speed, while strong enough to withstand the impacts of battle. The wheels were fitted with bronze tyres that could grip loose soil, and the entire vehicle was designed to maximise stability, while allowing the crew to fight effectively from a moving platform. But the real innovation wasn't in the chariot itself. It was in the systematic approach the Hittites took to training both horses and drivers. They developed one of the world's first known training manuals, a detailed text that outlined a 7-month program for conditioning war horses. The manual covered everything from daily exercise routines to dietary requirements, from the gradual introduction of harness work to the psychological preparation needed for battle. This wasn't the casual horse management of the steppes. This was scientific, methodical, and focused on producing animals that could perform reliably under the extreme stress of combat. The Hittites understood that, in warfare, a horse's failure could mean death not just for the animal, but for its crew and potentially for entire armies. The success of Hittite chariot warfare sent shockwaves across the ancient world. Within a few centuries, every major power from Egypt to Mesopotamia had developed their own chariot forces, each adapting the basic concept to their own tactical needs and cultural preferences. The horse had become the foundation of military power, and control over horse breeding territories became a strategic necessity for any nation with imperial ambitions. In Egypt, chariots became symbols of royal power, depicted in tomb paintings and temple carvings as the preferred vehicles of pharaohs and gods alike. Egyptian horse breeding programs focused on producing animals that could perform well in the desert conditions that characterized much of their territory, leading to the development of horses that were smaller and more heat-tolerant than their northern cousins. The Assyrians took a different approach, developing heavy chariots that could break through enemy infantry formations like battering rams. Their horses were bred for size and power rather than speed, and their tactics emphasized the psychological impact of mass chariot charges. An Assyrian army on the move, with hundreds of chariots raising clouds of dust and making the earth tremble with the thunder of hooves, must have been a terrifying sight for any enemy force. But perhaps the most sophisticated chariot culture emerged in China, where horse-drawn warfare reached levels of tactical complexity that wouldn't be seen again until the age of gunpowder. Chinese charioteers developed techniques for coordinated maneuvers involving dozens of vehicles, precise formations that could respond to hand signals and horn calls, and specialized roles for different types of chariots within the same army. The Chinese also pushed horse breeding to new heights of refinement. They established royal stables that housed thousands of animals, developed detailed records of bloodlines and performance, and created a classification system that recognized dozens of distinct horse types based on size, colour, gait, and temperament. Chinese horse culture became so sophisticated that knowledge of horses became one of the classical accomplishments expected of educated gentlemen. Yet for all their military importance, horses in these early civilizations remained expensive and relatively rare. A war chariot with its team of horses represented an investment equivalent to dozens of cattle or hundreds of sheep. Only the wealthy could afford to maintain them, which meant that chariot warfare was inherently aristocratic, dominated by a warrior elite that derived much of its social status from its association with horses. This created a feedback loop that would persist for thousands of years. Horses became symbols of nobility and power, which increased demand for them among the wealthy, which drove up their value and made them even more exclusive. The horse wasn't just changing warfare, it was reshaping the social structure of human civilization. But the age of the chariot was also creating new pressures on horse populations themselves. The demand for war horses led to intensive breeding programs that began to alter the animals in fundamental ways. Selective breeding for size, strength, and aggressive temperament produced horses that were quite different from their wild ancestors, both physically and behaviourally. These early domestic horses were still relatively small by modern standards, rarely exceeding 14 hands in height, but they were more muscular than wild horses with broader chests and more powerful hindquarters. Their heads were often more refined, with larger eyes and more mobile ears that made them better able to communicate with human handlers. Most importantly, their temperaments had been modified to make them more tractable and responsive to human control. This process of selective breeding wasn't just changing individual animals, it was beginning to create distinct breeds, adapted to different purposes and environments. Desert peoples bred horses that could survive on minimal water and poor forage. Mountain cultures developed sure-footed animals that could navigate rocky terrain, and the great powers of the river valleys created specialized war horses that combined size, speed, and the kind of controlled aggression needed for battle. The genetic diversity of domestic horses was becoming increasingly structured around human needs, rather than natural selection pressures. Wild horses had been shaped by predators, climate, and the availability of forage. Domestic horses were being shaped by human preferences, military requirements, and economic pressures. The species was diverging into something that had never existed before, an animal designed by and for human civilization. Yet despite their growing importance to human societies, horses remained vulnerable in ways that their wild ancestors had never been. Concentrated in stables and breeding facilities, they were susceptible to diseases that could wipe out entire populations. Dependent on human care for food and shelter, they could be devastated by warfare or economic collapse. And as breeding programs became more specialized, they were losing the genetic diversity that allowed their ancestors to survive in a wide range of environments. The horse's partnership with humanity was proving to be both the source of unprecedented opportunities and unprecedented risks. They had gained protection from most natural predators and access to more reliable food sources than the wild provided, but they had also become dependent on a species that was proving to be remarkably creative in its capacity for both care and destruction. As we move deeper into the Bronze Age and beyond, we'll see how this tension between opportunity and vulnerability played out across different cultures and civilizations. We'll witness the rise of mounted warfare, the development of horse-based nomadic empires, and the gradual spread of horses to every corner of the inhabited world. But we'll also see the first hints of the fragility that would eventually lead to the horse's near disappearance from its evolutionary homeland and its transformation from essential partner to nostalgic symbol. The age of the chariot was just the beginning. Ahead lay centuries of partnership, innovation, and change that would take the horse-human relationship to heights that neither species could have imagined when they first encountered each other on the wind-swept steppes of Central Asia. The chariot age was reaching its zenith when something even more revolutionary was brewing in the workshops and training grounds of the ancient world. Because while kings and generals were perfecting the art of horse-drawn warfare, a few bold experimenters were asking a different question. What if we got rid of the chariot altogether? The idea of mounting a horse directly, of becoming one with the animal rather than commanding it from behind, was not entirely new. Nomadic peoples had been doing it for centuries on the steppes, but integrating mounted warfare into the organised armies of civilized states, that was a different challenge entirely, one that would require rethinking everything from military tactics to social hierarchies. The first experiments were probably disastrous. Imagine trying to fight with a sword or spear while balancing on the back of a nervous animal with no saddle, no stirrups, and only a simple rope bridle for control. Early mounted warriors had to grip with their thighs while wielding weapons with their hands, a feat of coordination that took years to master and left many riders battered and bruised on the ground. But the advantages were undeniable for those who could master the technique. A mounted warrior was faster than any chariot, more manoeuvrable in rough terrain, and required far less logistical support. While a chariot team needed specially trained horses, reinforced vehicles, and smooth ground to operate effectively, a single horseman could fight almost anywhere with just one animal and basic equipment. The breakthrough came with the development of better tack. The invention of the saddle, though it wouldn't reach its full sophistication for centuries, gave riders a more secure seat and better control over their mounts. Improved bridles allowed for more precise steering. And gradually, through trial and error, warriors learned to fight from horseback, with something approaching the effectiveness of their ground-based counterparts. But the real revolution wasn't technological. It was social, because unlike chariot warfare, which required substantial wealth and could only be practiced by elites, mounted combat was potentially accessible to a much broader segment of society. A good horse was still expensive, but it was far less costly than maintaining a full chariot team. This democratization of horse-based warfare would have profound implications for military organization and political power. The first civilization to fully embrace this new form of warfare was Assyria, that relentless empire that dominated the ancient Near East for over 3 centuries. Assyrian kings like Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon the Teku built the world's first truly professional cavalry forces, units of mounted archers and spearmen who could strike deep into enemy territory and retreat before any organized response was possible. Assyrian cavalry tactics were sophisticated and ruthless. Light horsemen would harass enemy formations with arrows, drawing them into pursuit and separating them from their support. Heavy cavalry would then charge the disrupted enemy lines, breaking their cohesion and creating opportunities for infantry to exploit. The psychological impact was enormous. Armies that had never faced mounted opponents often broke and fled at the mere sight of horses thundering toward them. But the Assyrians didn't just use horses for warfare, they integrated them into every aspect of their imperial administration. Mounted messengers could carry orders across the empire in days rather than weeks. Cavalry patrols could monitor the vast frontiers and respond quickly to threats, and the mere presence of horse-mounted officials in provincial cities served as a constant reminder of imperial power. This integration of horses into the machinery of empire created new pressures on horse breeding and management. The Assyrians established royal stud farms that specialized in producing different types of horses for different military and administrative purposes. They developed sophisticated systems for training both horses and riders, and they created an entire bureaucracy dedicated to managing their enormous herds of military and civilian horses. The success of Assyrian cavalry sent ripples across the ancient world. In Persia, the Achaemenid dynasty built an even more extensive horse-based empire, one that stretched from India to Greece, and relied heavily on mounted forces for both conquest and administration. Persian cavalry became legendary for its skill and effectiveness, combining traditional step-riding techniques with Persian organizational genius. Persian horse culture reached levels of sophistication that wouldn't be matched again for centuries. They classified horses into multiple categories based on their intended use, from heavy war horses bred for shock combat to light, fast animals used for reconnaissance and communication. They established breeding programs that drew stock from across their vast empire, creating new bloodlines that combined the best traits of horses from different regions. The famous Nicaean horses of Media became symbols of Persian imperial power. These animals, described by ancient writers as tall, powerful, and proud-spirited, were reserved for the use of the king and his highest nobles. To ride a Nicaean horse was to display one's rank in the imperial hierarchy, and the theft of such an animal was punishable by death. Persian cavalry tactics were equally sophisticated. They developed techniques for coordinated charges involving hundreds of horsemen, methods for fighting in different types of terrain, and specialized formations for different tactical situations. Persian horse archers could shoot accurately from horseback at full gallop, a skill that required years of practice and created a mobile artillery force that could devastate enemy formations. But perhaps the most significant development in Persian horse culture was the integration of cavalry into combined arms tactics. Persian commanders learned to coordinate infantry, cavalry, and archers in complex battlefield maneuvers that maximized the strengths of each force while minimizing their weaknesses. This holistic approach to warfare would influence military thinking for centuries to come. Meanwhile, in the grasslands north of the Black Sea, the Scythians were developing horse culture to an entirely different level of sophistication. These nomadic peoples lived almost entirely on horseback, following their herds across vast seasonal migrations that covered thousands of miles. For the Scythians, horses weren't just military tools or symbols of status. They were partners in a way of life that had evolved over centuries to achieve perfect harmony between human needs and animal capabilities. Scythian horsemanship was legendary even in the ancient world. Greek historians described Scythian warriors who could shoot arrows backward while riding at full gallop, who could control their mounts with subtle shifts in weight while their hands were occupied with weapons, and who seemed to think and move as one entity with their horses. This wasn't just skill, it was a form of interspecies communication that approached the telepathic. The Scythians also developed breeding techniques that produced horses perfectly adapted to steppe life. Their animals were smaller than the war horses of settled civilizations, but incredibly hardy and enduring. They could survive harsh winters on minimal forage, cover enormous distances without rest, and maintain their health and vigor under conditions that would kill more pampered breeds. Scythian burial practices reveal the deep spiritual connection between these people and their horses. Elite Scythian tombs contain elaborate horse sacrifices, with dozens of animals killed and buried alongside their human companions. These weren't just displays of wealth, they were expressions of a worldview that saw horses as essential companions, not just in life, but in death and the afterlife beyond. The influence of Scythian horse culture spread far beyond the steppes themselves. Greek colonies on the Black Sea coast adopted Scythian riding techniques and horse breeding methods. Persian armies incorporated Scythian-style light cavalry into their forces, and the reputation of Scythian horsemanship became so legendary that kings and generals from across the ancient world sought to recruit Scythian mercenaries for their armies. But the true test of ancient cavalry came when the horse-based armies of the East encountered the disciplined infantry formations of the Greek city-states. The Persian invasions of Greece in the early 5th century BCE pitted some of the world's finest cavalry against what were arguably its most professional foot soldiers, and the results would reshape military thinking for generations. At Marathon in 490 BCE, the Athenians proved that well-trained infantry could defeat cavalry if the terrain and tactics were right. The narrow coastal plain limited the Persian horse's mobility, and the Greek phalanx formation proved resilient against mounted attacks. But this victory was as much about geography and preparation as it was about the inherent superiority of any particular military system. 10 years later at Plataea, the Greeks learned a different lesson when Persian cavalry under Mardonius nearly broke their army through superior mobility and harassment tactics. Only the discipline of the Greek infantry and the eventual death of Mardonius himself saved the Greek cause. The battle demonstrated that cavalry and infantry were most effective when they worked together rather than in opposition. These Greek-Persian conflicts established patterns that would influence cavalry development for centuries. Light cavalry proved most effective in open terrain where they could use their mobility to harass and retreat. Heavy cavalry could break infantry formations, but only if they could close to contact before being disrupted by missile fire. And the most successful armies were those that learned to combine different types of forces in flexible tactical systems. The lessons learned in these ancient conflicts would be refined and expanded by later military innovators, most famously by Alexander the Great and his Macedonian cavalry. But that story belongs to our next chapter, where we'll see how the partnership between horse and human reached new heights of effectiveness and began its long journey toward global dominance. For now, it's worth reflecting on how far both species had come since their first tentative encounters on the Central Asian steppes. Horses had evolved from wild prey animals into sophisticated partners in human civilization. Humans had learned to work with, rather than simply dominate these powerful creatures, creating relationships based on mutual benefit and trust. The age of classical cavalry was dawning, and with it would come some of the most dramatic chapters in both human and equine history. But already, in these early experiments with mounted warfare, we can see the foundations of partnerships that would shape the destiny of both species for thousands of years to come. The moment Alexander of Macedon first laid eyes on Bucephalus, neither could have known they were about to write one of history's most legendary partnerships. The year was 304 BCE, and the 13-year-old prince watched as his father's horse trainers struggled with a magnificent black stallion that seemed impossible to tame. The animal reared and struck at anyone who approached, his eyes rolling white with fear or fury. But Alexander saw something the adults had missed. The horse wasn't vicious or untrainable. He was afraid of his own shadow, literally. The young prince calmly approached, turned the horse toward the sun, so his shadow fell behind him, and mounted without incident. It was a moment that would become the stuff of legend, but more importantly, it marked the beginning of a partnership that would carry both horse and rider across 3 continents and into immortality. This wasn't just about one extraordinary horse and one remarkable boy. It was about the culmination of thousands of years of horse-human partnership reaching its most refined expression. By Alexander's time, cavalry warfare had evolved into an art form, and the Macedonian military machine he inherited represented the pinnacle of that evolution. The Macedonian cavalry wasn't just good, it was revolutionary. Unlike the light horsemen of earlier eras, who relied primarily on harassment tactics, or the heavy cavalry that served mainly as shock troops, Alexander's companions combined speed, power, and tactical flexibility in ways that had never been seen before. They could charge like heavy cavalry, maneuver like light horse, and fight as individual warriors when the situation demanded it. The horses themselves were marvels of selective breeding, standing 15 to 16 hands high, larger than most ancient horses. They combined the endurance of steppe ponies with the power of Near Eastern war horses. Their breeding programs drew stock from across the known world, creating animals that could carry armoured riders at speed while maintaining the agility needed for complex battlefield manoeuvres. But it was the training that set Macedonian cavalry apart. Both horses and riders underwent years of preparation that created partnerships bordering on telepathic communication. A companion could guide his mount with knee pressure alone, leaving both hands free for weapons. Horse and rider moved as one entity, responding to threats and opportunities with seamless coordination that turned individual warriors into components of a larger tactical organism. When Alexander launched his invasion of the Persian Empire in 334 BCE, he brought with him not just an army, but a mobile ecosystem built around horses. His cavalry provided reconnaissance, flank protection, and devastating shock action. But equally important were the thousands of pack animals, riding horses, and spare mounts that allowed his forces to move faster and farther than any army in history. The famous charge at Gaugamela in 331 BCE demonstrated what Macedonian cavalry could accomplish when perfectly executed. Alexander personally led his companions in a wedge formation that punched through the Persian line at its weakest point, creating a gap that his infantry exploited to win the battle and effectively end Persian resistance. It was a masterpiece of combined arms tactics that showcased the horse's evolution from simple transportation to precision military instrument. But Alexander's campaigns also revealed the limitations and costs of horse-based warfare. His army consumed enormous quantities of fodder, requiring complex supply chains that stretched across thousands of miles. Horses died from disease, exhaustion, and combat at alarming rates, forcing constant replacements that drained resources and disrupted unit cohesion. The famous mutiny at the Hyphasis River in India was triggered partly by the soldiers' reluctance to see more of their beloved mounts die in Alexander's endless quest for new conquests. The death of Bucephalus in India in 326 BCE marked more than just the loss of a famous horse. It symbolized the end of the classical age of cavalry warfare, when the partnership between individual horses and riders could still influence the fate of empires. Alexander founded the city of Bucephala in his mount's honor, but he would die himself just 3 years later, and with him died the unified empire that his cavalry had created. Yet the influence of Macedonian cavalry techniques spread far beyond Alexander's conquests. The Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from his empire's fragmentation all maintained sophisticated cavalry forces based on Macedonian models. The Romans, initially weak in cavalry, learned to integrate mounted forces into their legionary system. And across Central Asia, local rulers adapted Macedonian tactics to create their own hybrid military systems. In China, the Han dynasty was simultaneously developing its own sophisticated cavalry traditions, driven by conflicts with mounted nomads along their northern frontiers. Chinese cavalry differed from Western models in important ways, emphasizing archery over shock combat and developing techniques for fighting in the mountainous and desert terrain that characterized much of their territory. The famous heavenly horses that the Chinese imported from Fergana at enormous cost weren't just status symbols. They were strategic assets that allowed Han armies to project power deep into Central Asia and establish the trade routes that would become known as the Silk Road. Chinese horse culture became so sophisticated that it developed its own aesthetic dimensions, with poets composing verses about the beauty and spirit of particular breeds. But it was perhaps among the Parthians that post-Alexander cavalry reached its most innovative expression. The Parthian shot, the famous technique of turning to fire arrows while retreating, required extraordinary coordination between horse and rider, and represented a level of mounted archery skill that few other cultures achieved. Parthian cavalry tactics were so effective that they repeatedly defeated Roman legions and established an empire that lasted for nearly 5 centuries. The Parthians also developed the cataphract, the heavily armoured cavalry that would influence military thinking for centuries to come. These were not the relatively light Macedonian companions, but walking fortresses, horse and rider, both encased in scale or mail armour that made them nearly invulnerable to most weapons. A cataphract charge could shatter infantry formations through pure physical impact, but the weight of their armour made them slow and vulnerable to harassment by lighter forces. Roman military thinkers studied these various cavalry traditions and gradually developed their own synthesis. Roman cavalry was never the equal of specialist horse cultures like the Parthians or Sarmatians, but it was well integrated into the legionary system and capable of performing its assigned tactical roles effectively. More importantly, Roman logistics and engineering created the infrastructure that allowed cavalry forces to operate across the vast distances of their empire. The Roman road system, originally built for infantry legions, proved equally valuable for cavalry operations. Mounted messengers could carry orders across the empire in weeks rather than months. Cavalry units could be rapidly redeployed to respond to threats on distant frontiers, and the famous cursus publicus, the imperial postal service, relied heavily on horses and established way stations across thousands of miles of territory. But perhaps the most significant development in this period was the gradual shift from viewing horses primarily as military assets to seeing them as essential components of civilian life. While cavalry remained important for warfare, horses were increasingly used for transportation, agriculture, and communication in ways that integrated them into the daily life of ordinary people rather than just military elites. Roman Britain provides an excellent example of this transition. Archaeological evidence shows that horses were used not just by military units, but by civilians for farming, transportation and trade. Horse bones found in British sites show evidence of both riding and draft work, indicating that these animals were serving multiple roles within the same communities. This civilian integration of horses had profound implications for breeding and management practices. Military horses needed to be fast, aggressive, and responsive to combat situations. Civilian horses needed to be calm, reliable, and capable of performing routine tasks without specialized training. These different requirements led to the development of increasingly specialized breeds adapted to particular roles. The period from Alexander to the fall of the Western Roman Empire represents the classical age of cavalry, when the partnership between horses and humans reached levels of sophistication that wouldn't be matched again for centuries. It was an era when individual horses like Bucephalus could become historical figures in their own right, when cavalry charges could decide the fate of empires, and when the horse's role in human civilization seemed secure and eternal. But this classical synthesis was already showing signs of strain. The costs of maintaining large cavalry forces were enormous and growing. The specialized breeding programs required to produce military horses were vulnerable to disruption, and new military technologies, particularly improvements in archery and siege warfare, were beginning to challenge cavalry's battlefield dominance. More fundamentally, the social and economic systems that supported classical cavalry were changing. The city-states and kingdoms that had created the great cavalry traditions were being replaced by larger, more centralized empires that favored different military organizations. The personal bonds between individual warriors and their mounts that had characterized earlier periods were being replaced by more bureaucratic approaches to military organization. The stage was being set for a new chapter in the horse's story, one that would see these animals spread to every corner of the inhabited world and become integral to civilizations from Ireland to Japan. But it would also be a chapter marked by increasing specialization, commercialization, and ultimately the beginning of the long process that would lead to the horse's replacement by mechanical alternatives. The classical age of cavalry was ending, but the age of the horse was far from over. Ahead lay centuries of expansion, innovation, and partnership that would take horses and humans into new territories and new relationships. The thunder of hoofbeats would echo across continents as mounted peoples carried the horse-human partnership to its ultimate expression before the modern world began its slow transformation of both species' destinies. The classical world was crumbling, and with it, the organised cavalry forces that had dominated battlefields for nearly 1,000 years. But horses weren't disappearing. If anything, they were about to enter one of the most dynamic periods of their entire relationship with humanity. Because as the old empires fell apart, new peoples were rising from the margins, and many of them had spent centuries perfecting a very different kind of horse culture. The great migrations that swept across Eurasia between 300 and 600 CE weren't just movements of people, they were movements of entire ways of life, and at the centre of those ways of life were horses. The Huns, Goths, Vandals, and dozens of other tribal confederations that reshaped the map of Europe were fundamentally horse peoples, cultures that had evolved in the saddle and saw the world through equine eyes. These weren't the disciplined cavalry units of Rome or the aristocratic companions of Macedonia. These were entire societies on horseback, where children learned to ride before they could walk properly, where social status was measured in the quality of one's mount, and where the rhythm of seasonal migrations determined the structure of political and economic life. Take the Huns, those mysterious nomads who appeared seemingly from nowhere to terrorize the civilized world. Roman historians described them as barely human, living on horseback and sleeping in their saddles. While these accounts were clearly exaggerated and prejudiced, they capture something essential about Hun culture: the complete integration of human and equine life. Hun horses were small by the standards of Roman cavalry mounts, rarely exceeding 14 hands in height, but they were incredibly hardy, capable of surviving harsh winters on minimal forage and covering enormous distances without rest. More importantly, they were trained from birth to respond to their riders' slightest movements, creating partnerships so intimate that horse and rider seemed to share a single nervous system. Hun military tactics took advantage of this intimacy in ways that confounded their enemies. They could appear suddenly from any direction, strike with devastating effect, and vanish before any organised response was possible. Their composite bows, designed to be used from horseback, had ranges that exceeded most Roman weapons, and their horses' ability to change direction instantly made them nearly impossible to pin down in battle. But the Huns were just one of many horse cultures that were reshaping the post-classical world. In the Arabian Peninsula, Bedouin tribes were developing their own distinctive equine traditions, breeding animals that combined speed, endurance, and intelligence in ways that would influence horse culture for centuries to come. Arabian horses were different from their northern cousins in almost every respect. Smaller and more refined in build, they possessed an efficiency of movement that allowed them to travel vast distances across desert terrain that would kill other breeds. Their distinctive dished faces and arched necks weren't just aesthetic features, they were adaptations to desert life that improved their breathing and heat dissipation. More importantly, Arabian horse culture emphasized the individual relationship between horse and rider in ways that echoed the earliest steppe traditions. A Bedouin warrior's horse wasn't just his mount, it was his companion, his status symbol, and often his most valuable possession. These animals lived in close proximity to their human families, sharing their tents and developing bonds that lasted for life. The rise of Islam in the 7th century CE would transform Arabian horse culture from a regional tradition into a global influence. As Muslim armies swept across North Africa, into Spain, and deep into Central Asia, they carried with them not just their religion, but their horses and horsemanship traditions. The result was a cross-cultural exchange that enriched equine knowledge across 3 continents. In Spain, the encounter between Arabian and local horse breeds produced animals that combined desert endurance with European size and strength. These Iberian horses would later play crucial roles in the conquest of the Americas. But that's getting ahead of our story. For now, what matters is that the Islamic conquests created networks of horse knowledge that stretched from Morocco to India. Meanwhile, in the Far East, entirely different horse traditions were evolving. Chinese cavalry had reached new levels of sophistication during the Tang dynasty, when the empire's wealth and power allowed for breeding programs that drew stock from across Central Asia. Tang horses were larger and more powerful than their predecessors, bred specifically for the kind of shock combat that Chinese armies needed to dominate their steppe neighbours. But Chinese horse culture also developed aesthetic dimensions that had no parallel in the West. Tang artists produced sculptures and paintings of horses that captured not just their physical beauty, but their spiritual essence. Horses became symbols of imperial power, cosmic harmony, and the connection between earthly and celestial realms. The famous Flying Horse of Gansu, a bronze sculpture from this period, shows a horse in full gallop with one hoof touching a swallow in flight. It's not just a representation of speed, it's a meditation on the nature of movement itself, the way horses seem to transcend the normal limitations of terrestrial existence. Japanese horse culture developed along different lines, influenced by the island nation's unique geography and military traditions. Japanese horses were smaller than their continental cousins, adapted to mountainous terrain and the particular demands of samurai warfare. But what they lacked in size they made up for in agility and sure-footedness. The relationship between samurai and their horses became one of the most romanticized in world literature. These weren't just military partnerships, they were spiritual bonds that reflected Japanese ideals of loyalty, honor, and aesthetic refinement. A samurai's horse was expected to be not just obedient but intuitive, capable of anticipating its rider's needs and responding to unspoken commands. Back in Europe, the collapse of Roman authority had created a power vacuum that mounted warriors were quick to fill. The heavy cavalry that would dominate medieval warfare was beginning to take shape, built around the revolutionary innovation of the stirrup. The stirrup seems like a simple device today, just a loop of metal or leather hanging from a saddle. But its introduction to European warfare around the 8th century CE was genuinely revolutionary. For the first time, a mounted warrior could brace himself securely in his seat while delivering a blow, transferring the momentum of his charging horse directly into his weapon. This technological innovation transformed the economics and sociology of warfare. Heavy cavalry, armed with lances, became the dominant force on medieval battlefields, but maintaining such forces required enormous resources. A knight's equipment, including his warhorse, represented an investment equivalent to a modern luxury car. Only the wealthy could afford to fight this way, which reinforced and intensified the social hierarchies that defined medieval Europe. The war horses of medieval Europe were bred specifically for this new style of combat. They needed to be large enough to carry an armoured rider, strong enough to charge at full speed, and aggressive enough to strike and bite enemies on the battlefield. These weren't the elegant riding horses of earlier eras. They were living weapons, bred for size and power rather than speed or endurance. But medieval Europe also saw the development of more specialised horse types for different purposes. Palfreys were bred for comfortable riding over long distances. Coursers were developed for hunting and light cavalry work. Rounceys served as all-purpose riding horses for those who couldn't afford more specialised breeds. This diversification reflected the increasing integration of horses into all aspects of medieval life. The Crusades, beginning in the late 11th century, brought European horse culture into contact with Middle Eastern traditions in ways that enriched both sides. Crusader knights encountered Arabian and Turkish horses that were faster and more enduring than their European mounts. Muslim warriors marvelled at the size and power of European war horses, even as they developed tactics to exploit their limitations. These encounters led to extensive crossbreeding programs that produced new types of horses, combining Eastern and Western characteristics. The famous destriers of the later Crusades were often crosses between European heavy horses and Arabian or Turkish stock, animals that retained the size needed for shock combat, while gaining some of the endurance and agility of their eastern ancestors. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century represented perhaps the ultimate expression of horse-based nomadic culture. Mongol armies were essentially mobile cities, with every warrior mounted and leading multiple spare horses. This gave them strategic mobility that no sedentary army could match. They could appear hundreds of miles from where they were expected, strike with overwhelming force, and disappear before any effective response could be organized. Mongol horses were small and hardy, descendants of the same steppe breeds that had carried nomads across Eurasia for millennia. But Mongol horsemanship reached levels of sophistication that impressed even their enemies. Mongol warriors could eat, sleep, and fight without dismounting. They could shoot accurately from horseback at full gallop, and they maintained their mounts in fighting condition across campaigns that covered thousands of miles. The Mongol Empire's horse culture wasn't just military, it was administrative. The Yam, their postal relay system, used mounted messengers to carry information across the largest land empire in human history. A message could travel from Beijing to Kiev in a matter of weeks, faster than any other communication system until the age of telegraph. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Mongol horse culture was its sustainability. Despite the enormous demands they placed on their animals, Mongol herds remained healthy and productive across decades of constant campaigning. They achieved this through sophisticated understanding of horse biology and behavior, knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries of nomadic life. The Mongols practiced rotational grazing long before the term was invented, moving their herds constantly to prevent overuse of pastures. They understood seasonal breeding cycles and managed their herds to maximize reproductive success. Most importantly, they maintained genetic diversity by avoiding excessive inbreeding, ensuring that their horses remained hardy and adaptable. As the Mongol Empire fragmented in the 14th century, its horse culture spread and evolved in different directions. In Russia, the Golden Horde's influence helped create the Cossack traditions that would dominate the steppes for centuries. In Persia, Mongol practices merged with local traditions to produce new forms of cavalry warfare. In China, the Yuan dynasty's horse culture influenced military thinking long after the Mongols themselves were overthrown. But by this time, the horse's relationship with human civilization was beginning to change in fundamental ways. The age of mounted nomads was drawing to a close, not because horses were becoming less important, but because they were becoming more integrated into settled societies. The future belonged not to horse peoples, but to peoples who used horses, and that distinction would prove crucial in the centuries to come. The medieval period represents a high point in the horse's military importance, when cavalry dominated battlefields and horse-based mobility determined the fate of empires. But it also saw the beginning of trends that would eventually lead to the horse's replacement by mechanical alternatives. The costs of maintaining cavalry forces were rising, the infrastructure needed to support them was becoming more complex, and new military technologies were beginning to challenge their battlefield supremacy. Yet none of this was apparent to the warriors, nobles, and nomads who lived in the saddle during these centuries. To them, the partnership between horse and human seemed as eternal and natural as the changing of the seasons. They could not have imagined a world in which the thunder of hoofbeats would be replaced by the roar of engines, or that their beloved mounts would one day exist primarily as symbols of a vanished past. The age of the horse was approaching its zenith, but it was also approaching its transformation. Ahead lay centuries of exploration, conquest, and cultural exchange that would carry horses to every corner of the inhabited world. But also ahead lay the first hints of the technological changes that would eventually relegate these magnificent animals from essential partners to cherished memories. The story of horses and humans was entering its most expansive phase, but also its most complex. The simple partnership that had begun on the Central Asian steppes was about to become a global phenomenon, touching every continent and every culture. And in that expansion lay both the horse's greatest triumph and the seeds of its eventual obsolescence. The world was about to get much smaller, though nobody knew it yet. In the hulls of Spanish ships crossing the Atlantic in the early 1500s, alongside conquistadors and priests and dreams of gold, travelled creatures that hadn't set foot on American soil for 10,000 years. They were coming home to a continent that had forgotten them completely. When Hernán Cortés landed in Mexico in 1519, he brought with him 16 horses. Just 16. It seems like such a small number to change the course of history, but those horses represented something far more significant than their numbers suggested. They were the vanguard of a reunion that would reshape two continents and rewrite the relationship between horses and humans in ways that are still unfolding today. The horses that stepped onto Mexican beaches were descendants of the same Eurasian lineages that had walked across the Bering Land Bridge millions of years earlier, before disappearing from the Americas at the end of the Ice Age. Now they were returning as partners of a species that hadn't even existed when they first evolved on these grasslands. It was one of evolution's strangest circular journeys. But to the indigenous peoples who first encountered these animals, horses weren't returning relatives. They were monsters, demons, or gods. The Aztecs had no word for horse because no such creature existed in their world. They called them deer that carry people on their backs, struggling to fit these impossible beings into categories their language could handle. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine living your entire life in a world where the largest domesticated animals are dogs and turkeys, where human feet are the fastest form of land transportation, where warfare happens at walking speed. Then suddenly, beings appear that move like lightning and tower above you, carrying armoured figures who seem to be part human, part beast. Spanish chroniclers noted that indigenous warriors would often flee at the mere sight of mounted conquistadors, not from cowardice, but from supernatural terror. These weren't just new animals, they were violations of the natural order, creatures that challenged fundamental assumptions about what was possible in the world. But terror has a way of transforming into fascination, and fascination into mastery. Within a generation, some indigenous groups had not only overcome their fear of horses, but had begun to master them with a skill that impressed even the Spanish. The Chichimeca, peoples of northern Mexico, became such accomplished riders that they could outfight Spanish cavalry on their own terms. This rapid adoption wasn't just about learning to ride, it represented a complete restructuring of indigenous societies around equine capabilities. Plains tribes discovered that horses transform buffalo hunting from a dangerous, labour-intensive activity into something approaching an art form. A mounted hunter could select specific animals from a herd, pursue them at speed, and make kills that would have been impossible on foot. The Comanche became perhaps the most horse-obsessed culture in human history. By the 18th century, they had developed horsemanship skills that rivaled those of the ancient Mongols. Comanche warriors could shoot arrows accurately while hanging off the side of their mounts, using the horses' bodies as shields. They could change horses at full gallop, pick up wounded comrades from the ground, and fight battles that lasted for hours without ever dismounting. But the Comanche weren't just exceptional riders, they were exceptional horse breeders. They developed their own bloodlines, selecting for speed, endurance, and the kind of intelligence that made horses effective partners in warfare. Comanche horse herds numbered in the tens of thousands, representing wealth on a scale that transformed their entire economic system. Similar transformations were happening across the Great Plains as horses spread north and east from Spanish settlements. The Lakota, Cheyenne, Crow, and dozens of other tribes built new ways of life around equine partnerships. The horse didn't just change how these peoples hunted and fought, it changed how they saw themselves and their place in the world. The famous vision quests and spiritual practices of plains tribes often incorporated horses as sacred beings, intermediaries between the human and spirit worlds. Horse stealing became not just warfare, but a form of art, a way for young warriors to prove their courage and skill. The most honoured members of society were often those who owned the finest horses and rode them with the greatest skill. This indigenous mastery of horses created one of history's most remarkable ironies. The Spanish had brought horses to the Americas as tools of conquest, symbols of European technological and cultural superiority. But within a few generations, indigenous peoples had become better horsemen than their European contemporaries, using Spanish-introduced animals to resist Spanish colonization. The horse wars of the American frontier weren't just conflicts between different peoples. They were competitions between different horse cultures. Apache raiders on stolen Spanish mounts could outmaneuver US cavalry units. Comanche war parties could strike settlements hundreds of miles from their home territories and disappear before any pursuit could be organized. The mobility that horses provided had turned the tables on European military advantages. But horses weren't just transforming indigenous cultures, they were escaping from human control entirely, establishing wild populations that would become one of the most successful invasive species in American history. Spanish horses that wandered away from settlements or were lost in raids quickly adapted to life on the open range. These feral herds, which came to be called mustangs from the Spanish word mesteno, meaning wild or stray, multiplied with extraordinary speed. By the early 1800s, wild horse populations in some areas numbered in the millions. They had rediscovered their ancestral home and were thriving in ways that seemed to validate their evolutionary heritage. The Great Plains proved to be almost perfect horse habitat. Vast grasslands provided abundant forage, few natural predators remained to threaten adult horses, and the climate, while harsh, was similar to the steppes where their ancestors had evolved. Wild horses developed the lean, hardy characteristics that allowed them to survive without human care, while retaining the basic body plan that millions of years of evolution had perfected for grassland life. But this explosion of horse populations, both wild and domestic, was creating ecological pressures that few people understood at the time. Horses were competing with native herbivores for forage, altering vegetation patterns through their grazing habits, and changing the fundamental dynamics of grassland ecosystems that had evolved without large equids for 10,000 years. The bison, which had filled some of the ecological roles that horses once played, found themselves competing with these returning natives for resources. Wild horses could survive in areas where bison struggled, particularly during harsh winters when their smaller size and different foraging strategies gave them advantages over the larger animals. Meanwhile, on the eastern seaboard of North America, European colonists were establishing their own horse traditions based on different models entirely. These weren't the war horses of medieval Europe, or the hardy range animals developing in the West, but working horses bred for agriculture, transportation, and the particular demands of colonial life. Virginia planters imported English bloodlines to create horses suitable for fox hunting and racing, leisure activities that marked social status in colonial society. Pennsylvania Dutch farmers developed heavy draft breeds for ploughing and hauling, animals that combined size and strength with the docility needed for daily farm work. New England merchants bred light, fast horses for pulling carriages and carrying messages across the growing network of colonial roads. This diversification of horse types reflected the increasing specialization of American society itself. As different regions developed different economies and cultures, they bred horses to match their particular needs. The result was an explosion of genetic diversity that would have been impossible in the more constrained environments of Europe or Asia. But this diversity came with costs. Many colonial breeding programs relied heavily on imported stallions, creating genetic bottlenecks that reduced the overall hardiness of American horse populations. Inbreeding became a serious problem in some isolated communities, leading to horses that were elegant but fragile, fast but prone to injury. The Revolutionary War tested these various American horse traditions in ways that revealed both their strengths and weaknesses. Light cavalry units like those commanded by Francis Marion proved that American horses and horsemanship could match anything the British brought to the battlefield. But the war also demonstrated the enormous logistical challenges of maintaining cavalry forces, challenges that would influence American military thinking for generations. By the early 1800s, horses had become so thoroughly integrated into American life that it was hard to imagine the continent without them. They powered agriculture, transportation, communication, and warfare. They were symbols of freedom, status, and the American spirit of independence. The thundering herds of the Great Plains had become as iconic as the mountains or forests, part of the natural heritage that defined the American landscape. But this integration was built on a foundation that few people recognized. The horses that seemed so naturally American were actually returnees, immigrants carrying genetic memories of landscapes they had never seen but somehow recognized. They were living bridges between the deep past and the dynamic present, connecting the America that existed before humans with the America that humans were rapidly reshaping. The horse's return to the Americas represents one of the most successful reintroductions in natural history, but also one of the most complex. These animals didn't just fill empty ecological niches, they created new ones. They didn't just adapt to existing landscapes, they helped transform them. And they didn't just serve human purposes, they developed their own wild populations that existed entirely outside human control. As we move deeper into the 19th century, we'll see how this equine expansion continued to reshape both American landscapes and American cultures. We'll witness the rise of the cowboy, the cavalry wars of the frontier, and the development of horse industries that would make America one of the world's leading equine powers. But we'll also see the first hints of the changes that would eventually challenge the horse's central role in American life. The reunion between horses and their ancestral homeland was creating new possibilities and new problems in equal measure. The stage was set for some of the most dramatic chapters in both equine and human history, stories of partnership and conflict that would define the American experience for generations to come. The horse had come home, but home had changed beyond recognition during their long absence, and both species would have to adapt to a world that neither fully understood. The 19th century was supposed to belong to steam and steel, to the rhythm of factory machinery and the whistle of locomotives cutting across virgin territories. But if you had stood on the Great Plains in 1850, watching the horizon shimmer in the heat, you might have thought the future still moved on four legs. Because while inventors in distant cities were tinkering with internal combustion engines and visionaries were sketching plans for horseless carriages, the American West was experiencing the most intensive period of horse culture in human history. This wasn't just about transportation or warfare anymore. It was about the creation of entire civilizations built around the partnership between human ambition and equine capability. The cattle industry that emerged in Texas after the Civil War represented something unprecedented in the history of domestication. Here was an economic system that required horses not just as tools, but as partners in an enterprise that spanned thousands of miles and involved millions of animals. A single cattle drive from Texas to Kansas might involve a remuda of 100 horses supporting just a dozen cowboys, because the work demanded fresh mounts multiple times each day. These weren't the refined horses of European aristocracy or even the war horses of earlier American conflicts. They were working animals bred for endurance, intelligence, and what horsemen call cow sense, the ability to anticipate and respond to cattle behavior with minimal guidance from their riders. A good cutting horse could separate a specific steer from a herd of thousands, working almost independently while its rider focused on rope work and positioning. The cowboy culture that grew up around this industry created new forms of horsemanship that drew from multiple traditions. Spanish vaquero techniques merged with indigenous riding styles and frontier pragmatism to produce horsemen who could work cattle all day, fight hostile raiders when necessary, and cover enormous distances across trackless terrain. These weren't romantic figures from dime novels, they were skilled professionals whose livelihood depended entirely on their ability to work effectively with horses. But the American West wasn't just about cattle and cowboys. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 triggered migrations that required horse-powered logistics on a scale never before attempted. The Pony Express, though it lasted less than 2 years before being replaced by the telegraph, captured the imagination because it represented the ultimate expression of speed achieved through equine partnership. Pony Express riders covered nearly 2,000 miles in 10 days, changing horses every 10 to 15 miles at stations that were often little more than corrals and shacks in the wilderness. The horses they rode were selected specifically for speed and stamina, often Mustang thoroughbred crosses that combined wild hardiness with cultivated speed. Each rider typically weighed less than 125 pounds and carried nothing but mail and minimal supplies, maximising the efficiency of the horse-human partnership. The system worked because it was based on understanding horse physiology at a level that approached science. Station keepers knew exactly how far a horse could run at maximum speed before requiring rest. They understood nutrition, conditioning, and the psychological factors that determined whether a horse would give its best effort under extreme stress. This wasn't just horsemanship, it was applied biology. Meanwhile, the US military was learning its own lessons about horse-human partnerships in the context of frontier warfare. The Indian Wars of the late 19th century pitted two very different horse cultures against each other in conflicts that often turned on the quality of mounts and riding skills rather than weapons or numbers. Native American warriors, particularly the Comanche and Apache, had developed cavalry tactics that maximized the advantages of superior horsemanship. They rode smaller, more agile horses that could survive on poor forage and navigate rough terrain where larger military mounts struggled. Their intimate knowledge of horse behavior allowed them to execute complex maneuvers that confounded military commanders trained in European cavalry traditions. The US Army's response was to systematically study indigenous horsemanship and adapt their own methods accordingly. Military posts established breeding programs that crossed cavalry horses with captured Mustangs, trying to combine the size and power that military doctrine demanded with the hardiness and intelligence that frontier conditions required. But perhaps the most significant development of this period was the emergence of horse breeding as a scientific discipline. The establishment of registries for different breeds, the systematic recording of bloodlines, and the application of increasingly sophisticated genetic knowledge transformed horse breeding from an art into an industry. The American Stud Book, established in 1868, was part of a global movement towards standardizing horse breeds and maintaining detailed records of ancestry and performance. This wasn't just about improving horses, it was about creating predictable outcomes from breeding decisions. For the first time in history, horse breeders could make informed decisions about which animals to mate based on extensive data about their ancestors' characteristics and achievements. This scientific approach to breeding produced remarkable results. American horses began winning international competitions, proving that New World bloodlines could match or exceed those of Europe. The development of breeds like the American Quarter Horse, specifically adapted for working cattle, showed that selective breeding could create animals perfectly suited to particular tasks. But the increasing sophistication of horse breeding also revealed the limitations of the resource base it depended on. Wild horse herds that had seemed inexhaustible in the early 1800s were being systematically captured and broken for use in various industries. The genetic diversity that had made American horses so adaptable was being channeled into increasingly narrow breeding programs designed to produce specific traits. The environmental impact of this horse expansion was becoming impossible to ignore. Overgrazing by both wild and domestic horses was altering grassland ecosystems across the West. Competition with native wildlife was reducing populations of elk, deer, and other species that had once filled similar ecological niches. The very success of horses in their ancestral homeland was creating new problems that no one had anticipated. By the 1880s, the first voices were being raised in concern about wild horse populations. Ranchers complained that mustangs were competing with cattle for forage and water. Conservationists worried about the impact on native ecosystems. Military officials noted that the quality of wild horses was declining as the best animals were captured and the remainder bred without selection pressure. But these concerns were overwhelmed by the sheer momentum of horse-dependent industries. The American economy had become so thoroughly integrated with equine power that imagining alternatives seemed impossible. Cities were designed around horse transportation. Agriculture depended on horse-drawn equipment. Communication and commerce moved at the speed of the fastest horse. Urban centers like New York and Chicago housed hundreds of thousands of horses, creating logistical challenges that tested the limits of 19th century infrastructure. The manure problem alone required armies of workers and fleets of wagons to keep cities functional. Stables occupied enormous amounts of valuable urban real estate. The economic ripple effects of the horse industry touched everything from grain production to leather manufacturing. Yet even as horse culture reached these unprecedented heights, the seeds of its eventual decline were already being planted. The first successful internal combustion engines were puttering to life in workshops across America and Europe. Railroad networks were reducing the distances that could only be covered on horseback. Telegraph lines were making the Pony Express obsolete before it had fully established itself. But these technological changes seemed remote and theoretical compared to the immediate reality of horse-powered life. In 1890, there were more horses in America than there had ever been, and their numbers were still growing. The partnership between horses and humans had created a civilization that seemed as permanent as the mountains and rivers, the cowboys driving cattle across the plains, the cavalry troopers patrolling the frontier, the farmers ploughing their fields, and the city dwellers climbing into horse-drawn carriages had no reason to believe they were living at the end of an era. The age of the horse seemed destined to last forever, built on partnerships so fundamental that they had become part of the natural order. But history has a way of surprising even its most careful observers. The 20th century was approaching, and with it would come changes that would challenge everything that horses and humans had built together. The thunder of hoofbeats that had echoed across continents for thousands of years was about to be answered by the roar of engines, and nothing would ever be the same again. The horse's triumphant return to its ancestral homeland was creating the final, greatest flowering of equine civilization. But it was also setting the stage for the most dramatic transformation in the horse-human relationship complete. But the partnership was about to face since domestication began. The reunion was its ultimate test. Hello again, bored people. We've been following the horse's journey from those tiny forest creatures to the thundering herds of the American West. But now we're approaching one of the strangest chapters in this entire story. Because just as horses seem to have secured their place as humanity's eternal partners, just as their numbers reached historic peaks and their integration into human civilization seemed complete, something unexpected began to happen. The horse started disappearing. Not through some catastrophe or epidemic, but through something far more subtle and perhaps more profound. They were being replaced gradually and then suddenly by machines that could do their jobs better, faster, and without needing food, rest, or care. This is the story of how the most successful partnership in the history of domestication came to an end, not with violence or abandonment, but with the quiet efficiency of technological progress. It's a story that reveals something fundamental about the nature of utility, progress, and what we lose when we gain something new. The beginning of the end was so gradual that most people didn't notice it happening. In the 1890s, horses were still essential to virtually every aspect of human civilization. They powered agriculture, transportation, communication, and warfare. The idea of a world without horses was literally unthinkable to most people alive at the time. But in laboratories and workshops across the industrial world, inventors were perfecting technologies that would challenge every role horses had traditionally filled. The internal combustion engine was becoming reliable enough for practical use. Electric motors were proving efficient for urban transportation. Steam power was being refined for both stationary and mobile applications. The first automobiles were curiosities, expensive toys for the wealthy that broke down frequently and required extensive mechanical knowledge to operate. They were slower than horses on most roads, less reliable in bad weather, and completely dependent on an infrastructure of fuel and repair facilities that barely existed. Most observers dismissed them as novelties that would never replace the proven reliability of horse-drawn transportation. But the inventors kept improving their machines. By 1900, automobiles were becoming faster, more reliable, and less expensive. More importantly, they were beginning to offer advantages that horses simply couldn't match. They didn't get tired, they didn't require daily care, and they could operate in all weather conditions without losing efficiency. The transformation began in cities where horses had always been most problematic. Urban centres had reached the limits of what horse-based transportation could sustain. The sheer volume of manure produced by hundreds of thousands of working horses created sanitation challenges that threatened public health. Stables occupied valuable real estate that could be used more profitably for other purposes. And the noise, smell, and traffic congestion caused by horse-drawn vehicles were becoming intolerable to increasingly sophisticated urban populations. Electric streetcars offered a solution that seemed almost magical to people accustomed to horse-drawn omnibuses. They were quiet, clean, and capable of moving large numbers of passengers efficiently along fixed routes. They didn't produce waste, they didn't require feeding, and they operated on predictable schedules that weren't affected by animal behavior or weather conditions. The adoption of electric urban transit was remarkably rapid. Cities that had relied entirely on horses for public transportation in 1890 had largely electrified their systems by 1910. The thousands of horses that had once pulled streetcars and omnibuses through urban streets simply disappeared, replaced by silent, efficient machines that could work around the clock without rest. But urban transportation was just the beginning. In rural areas where horses had seemed irreplaceable for agricultural work, steam-powered and later gasoline-powered tractors were beginning to demonstrate their capabilities. A single tractor could pull ploughing equipment across fields faster and more efficiently than teams of horses, and it could work longer hours without rest. The economic advantages were compelling for farmers who could afford the initial investment. Tractors didn't require daily feeding, didn't need expensive stables, and didn't get sick or injured at critical moments in the agricultural calendar. They could work in weather conditions that would have been dangerous for horses, and they could be operated by a single person rather than requiring the specialized skills that horse-drawn farming demanded. The First World War accelerated these trends in ways that no one had anticipated. Military forces that had depended on horses for transportation and logistics discovered that motor vehicles offered enormous advantages in terms of speed, reliability, and carrying capacity. Trucks could move supplies faster and farther than horse-drawn wagons, and they could operate in combat conditions where horses would have been vulnerable and impractical. The war also demonstrated the limitations of horse-based cavalry in modern warfare. Machine guns, barbed wire, and artillery made traditional cavalry charges not just ineffective, but suicidal. Military leaders who had spent their entire careers perfecting mounted warfare tactics suddenly found themselves commanding obsolete forces in a conflict that had moved beyond the capabilities of any animal. But perhaps the most significant change was psychological. The war showed entire populations that mechanical alternatives to horses weren't just possible, but superior for most practical purposes. Soldiers who had grown up in horse-powered communities returned home with first-hand experience of motor vehicles, aircraft, and other technologies that made traditional transportation seem slow and inefficient. The 1920s saw the collapse of horse populations across the industrialized world happen with stunning speed. In America, the horse population peaked around 1915 at roughly 25 million animals, and then began declining precipitously. By 1930, the number had dropped to less than half that figure, and the decline was accelerating. This wasn't gradual replacement, it was systematic abandonment. Farmers sold their horses and bought tractors. Urban businesses replaced their delivery wagons with trucks. Even rural areas that had seemed permanently committed to horse-powered transportation were switching to motor vehicles as roads improved and fuel became more widely available. The horses themselves had nowhere to go. Unlike the gradual transitions of earlier technological changes, this replacement happened faster than breeding programs could adapt. Suddenly there were millions of horses that were no longer needed for any practical purpose, and very few people wanted to maintain animals that had become economic liabilities rather than assets. Many horses were simply slaughtered, their meat sold for pet food, or exported to countries where horse meat was still consumed by humans. Others were abandoned to fend for themselves, joining the wild herds that had never been fully domesticated, but most were sold to rendering plants, their bodies processed into glue, fertilizer, and other industrial products in a final grim conversion of their economic value. The speed and thoroughness of this transition shocked even those who had anticipated it. Within a single generation, the horse had gone from being humanity's indispensable partner to being an expensive anachronism maintained primarily for entertainment and nostalgia. The partnership that had defined human civilization for thousands of years had ended not with ceremony or recognition, but with the quiet efficiency of economic obsolescence. But something interesting happened as horses disappeared from practical use. They began to acquire new kinds of value, symbolic and emotional significance that had been obscured by their utilitarian roles. As fewer people worked directly with horses, more people began to romanticize them, to see them as symbols of freedom, natural beauty, and a simpler time when life moved at a more human pace. This romanticization created new industries built around horses as entertainment rather than transportation. Horse racing, which had always existed as a sport, became a major commercial enterprise. Rodeos celebrated the skills of cowboys and horses in stylized competitions that preserved the techniques of cattle ranching long after most ranches had mechanized their operations. And recreational riding emerged as a leisure activity for people who had never depended on horses for practical purposes. The wild horse herds of the American West, which had once been seen as competitors for grazing land and sources of free labor, suddenly became symbols of American freedom and natural heritage. Conservation groups formed to protect mustangs from capture and slaughter, arguing that these feral animals represented something essential about the American spirit that was being lost to industrialization. This transformation from utility to symbol marked a fundamental shift in how humans related to horses. For thousands of years, the partnership had been based on mutual benefit and practical necessity. Horses provided services that humans needed, and humans provided care and protection that horses required. But now the relationship became one-sided, with humans caring for horses primarily for emotional and aesthetic reasons, rather than practical ones. The implications of this change extended far beyond horses themselves. The end of the horse age marked the beginning of humanity's complete dependence on mechanical technology for basic transportation and labour. For the first time in our species' history, we had severed the partnership with animals that had defined our relationship with the natural world for millennia. This transition also revealed something profound about the nature of progress and loss. The motor vehicles that replaced horses were undoubtedly superior in terms of speed, efficiency, and reliability. They freed humans from the daily responsibilities of animal care and opened up new possibilities for travel and commerce. But they also eliminated forms of knowledge and relationship that had been central to human culture for thousands of years. The skills required to train, care for, and work with horses represented accumulated wisdom that had been passed down through countless generations. When horses disappeared from daily life, so did the intimate understanding of animal behaviour, the knowledge of breeding and genetics, and the complex social traditions that had grown up around equine partnerships. Modern people who had never worked with horses began to lose the ability to read animal body language, to understand the subtle communications between species, and to see themselves as part of the natural world rather than separate from it. The mechanization that made life more efficient also made it more isolated, replacing living partnerships with mechanical relationships that required technical knowledge rather than empathy and understanding. Yet the story of horses and humans didn't end with mechanization. Instead, it evolved into something different, a relationship based on choice rather than necessity, on emotional connection rather than practical dependence. The horses that survived the great replacement of the 20th century found new roles as companions, athletes, and symbols that revealed different aspects of the partnership that had always existed beneath the utilitarian surface. As we approach the end of our journey together, we'll explore how this transformed relationship has played out in the modern world, where horses exist primarily as reminders of what we once were and symbols of what we've lost and gained in our march toward technological mastery. The age of the horse may have ended, but the story of horses and humans continues to unfold in ways that illuminate both species' deepest needs and aspirations. The 21st century horse exists in a strange kind of limbo, suspended between memory and reality, between what it once was and what it has become. If you visit a modern stable today, you'll find animals that are genetically almost identical to the war horses that carried Alexander across Asia or the mustangs that thundered across the Great Plains. But their world, their purpose, their relationship to human civilization has been transformed beyond recognition. Today's horses live in a carefully constructed bubble of nostalgia and recreation. They are fed precisely measured diets, housed in climate-controlled barns, and cared for by veterinarians who understand their biology better than any horseman in history. They receive medical attention that would have been unimaginable to their ancestors, everything from advanced surgery to genetic testing to psychological therapy for behavioural problems. Yet for all this sophisticated care, modern horses exist primarily to fulfill human fantasies about what life was like when the world moved more slowly. Recreational riders seek experiences of freedom and connection with nature that seem increasingly rare in our digitized world. Horse shows and competitions preserve the aesthetic traditions of breeds that were originally developed for long-vanished purposes. Even the wild horse herds that roam protected ranges in the American West are managed populations, their freedom carefully orchestrated by government agencies. This transformation has created new forms of horse culture that would have baffled earlier generations. Therapeutic riding programs use horses to help disabled individuals develop physical and emotional skills, capitalizing on the animal's apparent ability to sense and respond to human emotional states. Equine-assisted psychotherapy treats everything from addiction to trauma, based on theories about the healing power of human-animal relationships. The scientific study of horses has revealed cognitive abilities that earlier horsemen intuited but couldn't prove. Horses can recognize human faces, remember individuals for years, and demonstrate problem-solving skills that suggest forms of intelligence quite different from, but perhaps parallel to our own. They show clear evidence of empathy, responding to human emotional states in ways that suggest they understand our feelings, even when we don't express them directly. But this scientific understanding has also revealed how profoundly domestic horses have been shaped by their long partnership with humans. Their behavior, their physiology, even their genetics bear the marks of thousands of years of selection for traits that humans valued. Modern horses are not wild animals that happen to live with people. They are living artifacts of one of history's most successful, collaborative relationships. The genetics of modern horses tell a story that would have shocked earlier breeders with their implications. DNA analysis has revealed that virtually all domestic horses descend from a surprisingly small number of founding stallions, creating genetic bottlenecks that have reduced the species' overall diversity. Many breeds that seem distinct are actually quite closely related, their apparent differences maintained more by breeding protocols than by fundamental genetic variation. This genetic narrowing has made modern horses more predictable, but also more vulnerable. Breeds developed for specific purposes often suffer from inherited disorders that were unknowingly selected for, along with desired traits. The thoroughbreds bred for maximum speed have fragile bones and hearts that frequently fail under stress. Draft horses bred for size and strength often develop joint problems that make their working lives brief and painful. The irony is that, as we've learned more about horse genetics and breeding, we've also lost much of the practical knowledge that allowed earlier horsemen to produce healthy, versatile animals without scientific understanding. Traditional horse cultures selected for overall soundness and functionality, qualities that don't always align with the aesthetic preferences or specialized performance demands of modern breeding programs. Wild horse populations, meanwhile, face challenges that illustrate the complexity of the modern relationship between horses and humans. The Mustang herds of the American West have become symbols of freedom and natural heritage, but they're also ecological problems that require constant management. These feral populations descend from domestic horses that were shaped by centuries of artificial selection, and their behavior in wild settings doesn't always align with conservation goals. Overpopulation has become a chronic issue as wild horse herds reproduce faster than their habitats can sustainably support them. Traditional predators like wolves and mountain lions exist in numbers too small to control horse populations naturally. The result is periodic population crashes from starvation and disease, cycles of boom and bust that create suffering for individual animals while threatening the long-term viability of the herds. Government agencies responsible for managing wild horses face impossible choices between animal welfare concerns and ecological realities. Roundups that remove excess animals from overpopulated ranges are traumatic for the horses and expensive for taxpayers, but allowing unlimited population growth leads to environmental degradation that affects entire ecosystems. Fertility control programs offer theoretical solutions but are difficult to implement across vast remote territories. The global horse industry has adapted to these modern realities by becoming increasingly specialized and commercialized. International competition circuits move horses around the world like expensive athletes, subjecting them to training regimens and performance pressures that would have been unthinkable when horses were working animals rather than entertainment products. The most successful competition horses live lives of extreme privilege and careful management, but also of intense pressure to perform at levels that push their physical and psychological limits. Horse racing represents perhaps the purest expression of this modern relationship, where horses exist primarily to fulfill human desires for speed, excitement, and the thrill of gambling. The industry produces animals of extraordinary athletic ability, but also subjects them to injury rates that would be unacceptable in any other context. The contradiction between public affection for horses and acceptance of their exploitation in entertainment reveals the complexity of contemporary attitudes toward these animals. Yet for all the problems and contradictions of modern horse culture, something essential persists in the relationship between horses and humans. People who work closely with horses still describe experiences of communication and partnership that seem to transcend ordinary human-animal interactions. The best trainers and riders develop relationships with their horses that involve forms of non-verbal communication so subtle and complex that they appear almost telepathic to outside observers. This persistence of meaningful connection suggests that the partnership between horses and humans was never based solely on utility or economic necessity. There was always something deeper involved, some form of interspecies communication and cooperation that fulfilled psychological and emotional needs for both species. The modern horse world, for all its artificiality and commercialization, still provides contexts where these deeper connections can develop aspects of this relationship that were always present but rarely. The therapeutic use of horses has revealed acknowledged in utilitarian contexts. Horses appear to have natural abilities to read human emotional states and respond appropriately, skills that may have been essential to their success as domestic partners long before anyone understood their therapeutic potential. Working with horses can teach patience, empathy, and non-verbal communication skills that transfer to human relationships and personal development. Perhaps most significantly, horses continue to serve as bridges between the human and natural worlds at a time when such connections are increasingly rare and precious. In a society where most people have minimal contact with animals beyond pets, horses offer opportunities for relationships with creatures that are large enough, intelligent enough, and responsive enough to function as genuine partners rather than merely objects of care. The environmental movement has embraced horses as symbols of what industrial civilization has lost through its separation from nature. Wild horse advocacy groups frame their conservation efforts not just in terms of animal welfare, but as preserving connections to natural processes and ways of life that industrial society has abandoned. The horse becomes a repository for values and experiences that seem threatened by technological progress. But this symbolic role also creates new burdens for horses themselves. They are expected to fulfill human needs for authenticity, natural connection, and spiritual experience that may have little to do with their own natures or needs. The romanticization that saved horses from complete obsolescence after mechanization also created unrealistic expectations about what relationships with horses can and should provide. Modern horse culture struggles with the tension between treating horses as individuals with their own needs and interests and using them to fulfill human desires for particular kinds of experiences. The most thoughtful contemporary horsemen and horsewomen try to balance these competing demands by developing training methods and management practices that respect horses' natural behaviours while still allowing for productive partnerships. The future of horses in human society remains uncertain in ways that would have been unimaginable during the millennia when they were essential partners rather than optional companions. Climate change, urbanisation, and economic pressures all threaten the infrastructure that supports recreational horse ownership. The knowledge and skills required to work effectively with horses become rarer with each generation that grows up without exposure to these animals. Yet horses also represent something irreplaceable in human culture, a living link to ways of life and forms of relationship that industrial civilization has largely abandoned. They offer experiences of partnership, communication, and connection with natural processes that may become increasingly valuable as virtual and digital experiences dominate human life. The question is not whether horses will survive in some form, but what forms their relationship with humans will take as both species adapt to a rapidly changing world. The story of horses and humans that began in the grasslands of Central Asia has evolved into something neither species could have anticipated. From practical partnership to symbolic relationship, from essential collaboration to optional recreation, the bond between horses and humans continues to reveal new dimensions, even as its fundamental nature remains mysteriously unchanged. In the patient eyes of a modern horse, we can still see reflections of the same intelligence, the same willingness to work with humans, the same capacity for partnership that first brought our species together thousands of years ago. The thunder of hoofbeats that once marked the rhythm of human civilization has been replaced by the hum of engines and the click of keyboards. But in quiet moments, in the space between human intention and horse response, the ancient conversation continues. It speaks not in words but in breath, in movement, in the subtle negotiations that define all meaningful relationships. The age of the horse may have ended, but the dialogue between horses and humans continues, quieter now, but no less profound, carrying forward the memory of what we once were and hints of what we might yet become. Hello again, bored people. We've followed horses from their emergence in prehistoric forests through their partnership with human civilization and their transformation into symbols of our technological past. But their story doesn't end with obsolescence or sentimentality. Instead, it continues to evolve in ways that illuminate both species' capacity for adaptation and the enduring power of relationships that transcend utility. The modern horse exists in a world that would be unrecognizable to both the wild horses of the Pleistocene and the working horses of just a century ago. Yet in that strange new world, horses and humans continue to discover new forms of partnership, new ways of communicating, and new sources of meaning in their ancient alliance. The final chapter of their story together is still being written, one quiet conversation at a time, in stables and pastures around a world that has moved beyond the need for horses, but not beyond the need for what horses represent. The 21st century brought something unexpected to the horse's story. After thousands of years of partnership, defined by necessity, utility, and survival, horses found themselves in uncharted territory. They were no longer needed, not in any practical sense that their ancestors would have recognized. The ploughs were pulled by tractors, the messages carried by fibre optic cables, the cavalry replaced by helicopters and armoured vehicles. And yet somehow, horses didn't disappear. Instead, they discovered something remarkable. They could matter for reasons that had nothing to do with work. In veterinary hospitals across the world, researchers began documenting something that horsemen had always suspected but never quite understood. Horses, it turned out, possessed an almost supernatural ability to read human emotions. Not metaphorically, not in some mystical sense, but measurably, scientifically, with precision that bordered on the uncanny. Their heart rates synchronized with their handlers during moments of stress. They responded to human facial expressions with behaviors that suggested genuine empathy. They seemed to know things about us that we barely knew about ourselves. This discovery transformed horses from obsolete machinery into living therapy. Children with autism who struggled to connect with other humans found they could communicate wordlessly with horses. Veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress discovered that the rhythmic motion of riding could calm nervous systems shattered by war. People recovering from addiction learned to rebuild trust by forming relationships with animals that demanded honesty, presence, and patience rather than clever manipulation or emotional performance. The science behind these therapeutic effects was as fascinating as it was mysterious. Horses, as prey animals, had evolved exquisite sensitivity to the emotional states of creatures around them. In the wild, Detecting the anxiety of a herd mate or the predatory intent of a stalker could mean the difference between life and death. Thousands of years of domestication hadn't dulled these abilities. If anything, it had refined them toward human-specific cues. Modern horses could read micro-expressions on human faces, detect changes in breathing patterns that indicated stress or relaxation, and respond to pheromone signatures that humans couldn't even consciously perceive. They had become living biofeedback machines, mirrors that reflected our emotional states back to us with uncomfortable accuracy. Working with horses became a form of radical honesty, because horses responded not to what people said they felt, but to what they actually felt. This therapeutic revolution created new professions and new forms of training that would have seemed like magic to earlier generations of horsemen. Equine-assisted therapists learned to interpret horse behavior as a diagnostic tool, reading the animal's responses to human clients as indicators of psychological states and therapeutic progress. Horses became partners in healing processes that had nothing to do with physical labor or transportation. But the therapeutic applications were just one dimension of horses' evolving role in human society. In the world of competitive sports, horses had transformed into athletes whose training regimens and performance monitoring rivaled those of human Olympic competitors. Modern sport horses lived lives of extraordinary privilege and careful management, their diets calculated to the gram, their exercise programs designed by exercise physiologists, their psychological well-being monitored by specialists in animal behavior. The global horse industry had become a multi-billion-dollar enterprise built around pursuits that earlier generations would have considered frivolous luxuries. International show-jumping events moved horses around the world like precious cargo, subjecting them to travel schedules and competitive pressures that pushed the boundaries of what these animals could endure. Dressage competitions showcased partnerships between horse and rider that achieved levels of communication and coordination that seemed almost telepathic. Yet this commercialization of horse culture created new ethical dilemmas that earlier generations had never faced. When horses were working partners, their welfare was inherently linked to their productivity. A lame horse couldn't pull a plough, an injured cavalry mount couldn't carry a soldier into battle. But in the entertainment and sport industries, the pressure to perform could sometimes override considerations of animal welfare in ways that would have horrified practical horsemen of earlier eras. The thoroughbred racing industry exemplified these contradictions. Modern racehorses were genetic marvels, bred for speed that pushed the absolute limits of equine physiology. They could run faster than any horses in history, their bloodlines refined through centuries of selective breeding toward a single, obsessive goal. But this genetic specialization had created animals that were beautiful and fast but also fragile, prone to injuries that ended careers and often lives. The same breeding programs that produced these magnificent athletes also created genetic bottlenecks that reduced the overall health and resilience of horse populations. Inbreeding coefficients in some breeds approached levels that would be considered dangerous in any wild population. The pursuit of specialized performance had created animals that excelled in narrow domains, but lacked the robust adaptability that had allowed their ancestors to thrive across diverse environments for millions of years. Meanwhile, in the remote corners of the American West, wild horse herds continued to embody a different vision of what horses could be. These feral populations, descendants of domestic animals that had returned to wild living, represented a kind of evolutionary experiment in real time. Freed from human selection pressures, they were slowly readapting to natural conditions, their bodies becoming leaner and hardier, their behavior shifting back toward patterns that served survival rather than human preferences. But even these wild horses existed within human-managed systems. Government agencies monitored their populations, controlled their movements, and intervened when their numbers grew beyond what the range could support. The wildness was real but circumscribed, freedom bounded by invisible fences of policy and management. They were wild animals living in a domesticated landscape, symbols of liberty that required constant oversight to maintain their symbolic value. The contradiction extended to the emotional attachment people felt toward these wild herds. Urban populations that had never lived with working horses romanticized the Mustangs as embodiments of American freedom and natural authenticity. But the ranchers and land managers who dealt with their ecological impact saw them differently, as feral animals competing with native wildlife and domestic livestock for limited resources. This tension between symbol and reality characterized much of the modern relationship between horses and humans. People wanted horses to represent something pure and natural in a world increasingly dominated by artificial systems. But the horses themselves were products of thousands of years of artificial selection. They were nature, but nature reshaped by human needs and preferences in ways so fundamental that true wildness might no longer be possible for them. The genetic research that was revolutionizing understanding of horse breeding also revealed the deep history of this transformation. DNA analysis showed that domestic horses carried genetic variants that affected everything from coat color to temperament, changes that had been selected for by human breeders long before anyone understood the mechanisms involved. Modern horses were living libraries of human preferences, their genomes encoding thousands of years of aesthetic and functional choices. Some of these genetic changes had unexpected consequences. The genes that produced the spotted coat patterns prized in certain breeds also caused night blindness in some horses. The muscling that created the powerful hindquarters, valued in sport horses, sometimes came with increased susceptibility to certain metabolic disorders. The breeding decisions made by horsemen who knew nothing of genetics had created complex trade-offs that modern science was only beginning to understand. This genetic knowledge created new possibilities and new responsibilities for horse breeders. For the first time in history, it became possible to test for many inherited disorders before breeding decisions were made, potentially eliminating genetic diseases that had plagued certain bloodlines for generations. But it also raised questions about how far genetic manipulation should go in pursuit of desired traits. The same technologies that allowed for genetic testing also opened the door to more dramatic interventions. Cloning had already produced identical copies of exceptional performance horses. Gene editing technologies offered the possibility of directly modifying horse genetics to enhance desired traits or eliminate unwanted ones. The line between selective breeding and genetic engineering was becoming increasingly blurred. So here we are, bored people, at the end of a journey that spans 55 million years. From tiny forest creatures with multiple toes to the sleek athletes and beloved companions of today. We've watched horses evolve, migrate, disappear, and return. We've seen them carry empires, transform civilizations, and eventually transform themselves from essential partners into living symbols of everything we've gained and lost in our march toward modernity. The horse's story is our story too. It's a reminder that the most profound partnerships aren't always built on dominance or utility, but on something deeper, something that persists even when the original reasons for connection have long since vanished. In a world of screens and engines, horses continue to offer us what they always have: presence, patience, and the ancient memory of what it means to move together through an uncertain world. That's Muted History for tonight, bored people. Stay curious.